Good evening. Welcome to the second Marie Colvin Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Howie Schneider. I am the Dean of the School of Journalism. I want to welcome all of our students in news literacy, in journalism. I want to welcome our faculty. I want to welcome people, university community, and those of you who come from the general community. It's a very special night for us. Before we introduce our speaker, I want to tell you a little bit about why we're here. Because we're here to hear a very remarkable person talk to us, but we're here really to remember the legacy and the work of Marie Colvin, who for 30 years, Marie Colvin is right here with that eye patch. For 30 years, Marie Colvin was one of the most fearless, passionate, enterprising foreign correspondents in the world, who really highlighted the plight of innocent civilians who were trapped in conflicts all over the world. In 1989, for example, she refused to evacuate a UN compound that was under attack so she could dramatize the plight of 1,500 women and children who were trapped in that compound, and she risked her life to do that. Her work took her to Zimbabwe, to Kosovo, it took her to Chechnya and Iraq, and her work took her in the winter of 2012 to Syria, where she was tragically killed while covering that conflict, which obviously is still in the news. In fact, the night before she was killed, she broadcast a report from an orphanage on CNN about babies who were dying in that crossfire. After Marie Colvin died, we at the journalism school at Stony Brook were thinking about what could we do to honor her memory and her legacy. And we decided that we would create a center in her name to carry on her work. One of the ways we would carry on her work would be to send our students overseas. And one of the ways that we would carry on her work was invite the most courageous foreign correspondents in the world to come here and to talk to us about their experiences. Our speaker tonight, by the way, says this about Marie Colvin. Her legacy is an inspiration to all of us who were lucky enough to have known her and who are privileged to do this kind of work. Before we introduce the speaker, I would like to acknowledge two people in the audience. I'd like them to stand briefly. I'd like to introduce to you Marie Colvin's brother Billy and her mother Rosemary. And I left out an important fact. Where do you think Marie Colvin grew up? Long Island. Okay, and that made it even more special to us that she was a native Long Islander and grew up 20 miles from this campus. To introduce our speaker, I'm going to ask one of the professors in the journalism school to come up here for a second. Her name is Alana Azurnoy. She joined our faculty 2 years ago after being a correspondent herself covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, Alana, do you want to come up for just a second?
Hello. It's so great to see so many students here tonight, and also people from outside of Stony Brook. I want to welcome all of you. We are so incredibly excited to have Clarissa Ward here as our second annual Marie Colvin Center Distinguished Lecturer. First, if you guys remember, last year was Christiane Amanpour, and now, I was just amazed. I was talking to Clarissa. I'm so impressed. She is only 33 years old, okay? So she's not much older than you guys. And in the last 7 years working as a foreign correspondent, she has been to China, to Russia. She's covered the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And 3 weeks ago, she was in Syria. And now she's at Stony Brook University. It's amazing. Along the way, she has picked up so many awards, the Peabody, the DuPont, the David Bloom Award, the Emmy. She's also nominated for 3 Emmys this year. That's on October 1st, so wish her luck. For her incredibly courageous, intrepid, and dogged correspondence from Syria. She was one of the first reporters to report. She was actually the first reporter to report from rebel territory in Syria. And she will tell you the story of how she went in there with just a camera as a tourist. Please join me in welcoming Clarissa Ward to Stony Brook University.
Wow, I feel very humbled by that extremely flattering introduction. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and also Dean Schneider, Professor Ozernoy, Professor Miller, the faculty of the Journalism School, the News Literacy Program, and of course, the Marie Colvin Center for International Reporting. It's really a tremendous honor for me to be here tonight speaking to you. And it's also particularly poignant for me because it's a time to remember Marie Colvin, who was the kind of journalist, an all too rare species these days, who really gave us something to aspire to. I first met Marie in 2006 in Gaza in a small hotel on the Mediterranean. And it's fair to say that I was completely intimidated, intrigued, and absolutely inspired by her. She was passionate, brave, committed, vibrant, indomitable, funny, human. I really could go on. And the night before she died, I had just left Syria, in fact, and I was watching with a mixture of fear and horror as she gave interview after interview over Skype on the relentless bombardment of the Baba Amr neighborhood in Homs, where she was talking about what she was witnessing, and in doing so, forever etching the suffering of those civilians into history. And then the next day she was gone, and the silence of the void that she has left behind is deafening. In the wake of her death, so many friends and so many people I meet have asked me, why do you do this kind of work? Why do you risk your life to tell stories that aren't even your own? Why would you ever choose to bear witness to such brutality? Social media has changed the world, they say. You don't need to go in and risk your life. People have iPhones, they'll put it up on YouTube. And I have a few answers to those questions, which I thought I would share with you today. First of all, a little bit of background on me and how I got started. I majored in comparative literature from Yale University with a concentration in French, Italian, and Russian literature. After college, I did an internship at CNN in Moscow for a few months, and then I got back to New York, and CNN was like, well, you're gonna have to wait for a few months if you wanna get a job, and I was like, I don't have a few months, I'm 22. So Fox News was like, well, we have a job on the over-assignment desk for less than minimum wage, and I was like, yes, let's do it. So I started out at the very, 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 very bottom. And I learned the ropes in a newsroom, and I think it's fair to say that I paid my dues. But when I would finish work at 9 a.m. every morning, I would go and do Arabic lessons with this incredible woman from Yemen called Nadia, who, aside from sort of trying to teach me rudimentary Arabic grammar, would also talk to me about Islam, about life in Yemen, about her 7 children, about her understanding of 9/11 and how it happened and why it happened. And it was so mind-blowing to me and so inspiring, and it was really, I think, the first taste I had been given of the Middle East and this region that we heard about all the time in the news and associated with death and destruction, but really understood so little about. And in fact, it inspired me so much that I was like, I'll quit my job and move to Beirut, even though I had never been to Beirut, but it really sounded like a good idea. And it was, thankfully. So I moved to Beirut, and I started to work as a freelance producer there, and I went back and forth to Baghdad and Gaza and various other places across the Middle East. And then I was fortunate enough to have my first opportunity to report. In 2006, I was told, well, you know, you're really young to be a reporter, but if you want to go, we have one shift that will try you out. It's Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Eve. Awesome. Christmas in Baghdad, yes. So I went, and actually Saddam Hussein was executed a few days after Christmas, and I basically lived in the live shot position for 48 hours. And then I was hired by ABC News to be their Moscow correspondent for 2 years, and then I moved to Beijing to be their Asia correspondent. And then after that, I was hired by CBS News, my current home, based in London, but covering mostly the Middle East, and specifically I've spent much of the last 2 years, as Ilana mentioned, covering Syria. So in the 10 years since I've been working in news, I have seen a lot of horrible things. A lot of death, a lot of senseless killing, a lot of tragedy. I've sat in a room full of women shrieking and tearing clumps of their own hair out of their scalps because they've just found out that the man of the house was killed. I've watched them wailing and weeping over the bodies of their dead sons. I've sat with a 9-year-old girl struggling to stay alive after a shell hit her house, killing her pregnant mother and all of her siblings. I've seen the mutilated corpse of an activist left by the roadside as a grim warning to any other would-be activists. I've sat with a group of women who hadn't left their house in a month because their nerves had been so shattered by the constant bombardment. And that was just in Syria. I've also come a lot closer than I would have liked to being injured or killed myself on a couple of occasions. And just to be clear, in those moments, I haven't felt a jolt of excitement or a thrill from the adrenaline rush. I have felt sick with fear. I don't do this job because it makes me feel cool or glamorous. I don't do it because it makes my life much more exciting, because believe it or not, 90% of your time in war zones is spent staving off boredom and killing time. I don't do it because I have lots of great stories to tell, though, to be honest, if you give a group of journalists in a room a few drinks, there will be some amazing stories that will soon start slipping from their lips. But the reason I do this is because in its more profound moments, I really feel that I am being given the privilege of witnessing history in the making. I do it for the same reason that I love to learn languages, because it affords me access to an intimacy with people and places that I might otherwise know very little about. I do it because it teaches me to listen. And listening is not something we do very much of these days, which is a real shame, because listening to people's stories can unlock the doors to all the hidden treasures of these cultures that we know and understand so little about. And I do it because in the US right now, and with the rapidly changing culture of news, I sometimes worry that we're not listening enough, that we're more interested in hearing what we want to hear than in trying to process and understand difficult realities. There's a stigma to international news these days, that it's somehow boring or difficult or unpopular with viewers, that research really shows that people change the channel if you talk about the Middle East. So instead of just improving the quality of telling our storytelling on these complex issues, we should just really stop talking about it. And I really just have one thing to say about that. And I'm not going to say it because in case anyone is tweeting in the audience, and it would get me into trouble. But suffice it to say that I think that is really so very wrong. What is happening in Syria right now will have long-term repercussions for the US and for Americans for many years to come. What is happening in China right now is changing the world that we live in and the role that the US economy has to play in it. Who doesn't want to learn more about these fascinating issues. This isn't just about like the geopolitics of all of this and why these things are important. This is really cool and interesting and fascinating stuff, and going to cultures all over the world and, learning about why most Chinese people in China are atheists and how does that affect their culture. Or going to Russia and talking to an old lady, or a babushka as they call them, and finding out why she's complaining about how much better life was under Stalin. Who doesn't want to go and experience the sights and smells of a country like India? This is deeply fascinating, cool, interesting stuff. And I should hasten to add right here that I'm fortunate enough to work at CBS News, which is proudly and fiercely committed to international news, or more importantly, to telling great stories, because that's really what this is about. This is not intellectual snobbery, okay? I'm not like, oh, I only read the New Yorker. And no, I get back from like a long trip and like open a bottle of Jack Daniels and watch reality TV for 5 hours, okay? I watched the Emmys last night and was BBMing with my girlfriend the whole way through about who had the best outfit. And by the way, I think maybe Julia Louis-Dreyfus, but we can talk about that later. But this isn't, so that's my point is, this isn't about like, oh, certain people care about certain types of stories and certain types of issues and other people care about different things. No, this is about us being engaged with the world around us, about us having our eyes and ears open and paying attention to this global community that we live in. And right now, the world is smaller than it ever was. A massacre happens in Syria, and people in Pennsylvania know about it in a matter of hours. Thanks to YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, information ripples across the globe in the bat of an eyelid. But this information isn't really terribly useful to us, or it can be overwhelming to us, let's say, if there aren't people out there who have seen it for themselves, who have been on the ground themselves, who can take this information and try to understand it, feel it, interpret it, communicate it, and make it accessible for all of us. And I guess that's what I aspire to do in my work. It's what Marie Colvin was doing up until the day that she died. And it's what I hope some of you will choose to do with your lives as well. And on that note, I think Alana and I are going to have a chat, and if you guys have any questions, we can talk more about other things.
Okay, so we're just going to do a Q&A, and a lot of the students who are taking news literacy, as well as our new Journalism 105, The Mind of a Reporter, all of them submitted questions to us, which we went through and talked about what were the most common ones, the most interesting ones. So we're going to ask Clarissa some of those questions, and then we're going to open up the floor to you guys. And when we do, I want you to line up neatly and orderly, which I know you guys can do, on both sides, and we'll take your questions, and we will have you out of here by 9:30. Okay. Thank you. So that was amazing.
Thank you.
That's great. I mean, you have really seen a lot of stuff in the last 10 years working as a correspondent. How do you convince your editors to get those stories on television?
Well, as I mentioned briefly, I'm really lucky to work at CBS, which I think is, and obviously I'm biased, but I really do believe this. I think that CBS is one of the few networks at the moment that's super committed to international news, to stories that challenge us, and to stories that are super important. So I actually haven't had to struggle too much with CBS. I think at the end of the day, a great story is a great story. And stories are about characters and people, and if you meet someone who's fascinating and who has an amazing story to tell, you have a great story, and it shouldn't be some huge fandango to try and sell that to your editors or get it on television just because that person is a Muslim or is a Syrian or doesn't speak English. But as I said, I'm lucky at CBS.
So because you're speaking to an audience of college students, I want to know, what were you like as a college student?
Oh, we're so not going there.
We're going there. Let's go.
Well, honestly, I was. I enjoyed La Dolce Vita, but no, I was profoundly affected. 9/11 happened during my senior year of college, and that really completely rocked my world. It was. I just think it just changed everything. And I had really grown up in a pretty sheltered existence and was very happy sort of, smoking cigarettes and thinking about French New Wave cinema. And suddenly it was like, wait, things are happening in the world that are so important and are changing the way that we live, and they need to be paid attention to, and we need to be understanding these things better, and we need people who can act as I don't know, I guess you can think of journalists sometimes as translators, or people who are going and looking at these complicated issues and trying to bring you back home a picture of what's happening and why it's important.
So if you could give one piece of advice to your past self, what would it be?
To my past self? Well, the piece of advice I always give people is bring granola bars. If you're a picky eater, it's not the career for you, my friends, because it's, this isn't for everybody, right? There's a lot of, aside from the whole bombs and things, there's a lot of sleeping on floors, there's a lot of, eating fermented yak's milk if you're lucky enough to be on the Mongolian steppe one night. So I think you have to be willing. I mean, my point more largely is that you really have to be willing to go with the flow, because if you go into these places and you're like, I'm American and I have a timetable and we're going to shoot this segment and then we're going to go do that and then we're going to go do that, and fate will just laugh at you and be like, ha 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 ha, you clearly have not spent time here before, because that's not how it works. We're going to sit and drink tea and smoke cigarettes for 5 hours, and then maybe we'll shoot something. So I would just say to my past self, learn to be a little bit flexible.
So we showed to our students a clip of you with your mobile phone and the rebel leader, and you really stuck it to him. So for the students who haven't seen the clip, I want you to set up the scenario. Tell us what happened, what you were thinking in that moment, and then I'm going to ask you a few more questions about it.
So this was for a 60-minute story, my first 60-minute story, about the city of Aleppo in Syria. And most of the story was about the kind of the sort of constant bombardment and how this had kind of torn away at the social fabric of this once incredibly beautiful, thriving economic hub. And it also dealt with the rise of radicalism within the rebellion, within the opposition, because essentially when you have a vacuum and people don't fill it, then you sometimes get some really nasty people in who do fill it, and that's what we've seen happening in Syria. So we were hearing that a lot of these rebel leaders were becoming influenced by extremist ideology and by radicals from outside who were coming into Syria and kind of filling that vacuum. And so we had met this sheikh, or a rebel leader, who we essentially had found video of him. Well, first of all, we went and interviewed him and said, what's your policy on treating your prisoners, and blah, blah, blah. And he said, oh, well, my prisoners are so happy here, they sometimes don't want to leave. And then he gave us some video at the end of 4 Syrian soldiers who they had captured basically in some kind of illegal proceedings. Well, we had separately sourced video, the same piece of video that starts with the 4 Syrian soldiers, but it has the next scene in the clip, which is them executing the 4 Syrian soldiers in an orchard. So my producer had the brilliant idea of, let's go back and confront the jihadi leader with the evidence. And so that's what you're about to watch. And, I don't know, look, we take risks very seriously, and we spent a long time kind of working this out and how we could do it and do it in a way that wasn't going to be stupid. But, I mean, it's still fair to say that, I was not digging this moment. I mean, it was extremely scary.
Take us through that rationale. I mean, how do you weigh the risk versus reward?
It's like, I think I compare it to like cracking a safe, right? You get a germ of a story idea in your head that you want to do, and then you sit there and you try to work out how it's possible to do the story, if it's possible to do the story, and you can sit there for hours or days or as long as it takes until you get an idea in your head of whether the story is doable or how it's doable, and then you go on to the next phase is, okay, is it worth it? You know, what's the risk-reward ratio? Because sometimes it's just not there. And if you're going to take a really big risk for a story, you want it to be a story that you feel is going to make an impact and is going, you know, and is really important. And as we saw with the work that Marie was doing on, you know, just before she was killed, I mean, this was hugely important. She was the only one there really bearing witness to this. So it's a calculation that we take very seriously, and everybody has their own sense of like how far is too far. And the beauty of working in television is that we're a team, and if one person in the team, and it doesn't matter if it's, you know, me or the driver, if one person in the team is like, I'm not comfortable, then that's it, go back home.
And so when you guys were about to face the rebel leader and
Yeah.
you have this, I mean, what were you thinking? What was going through your head?
I was thinking, how long do we have to be there? Like we were trying to work out the amount of time, and we decided 15 minutes. If we could just go in there and do it in 15 minutes and then drive back. So then, of course, you're thinking, you know, because you're so it was really nerve-wracking. And it's nerve-wracking in any scenario, and 60 Minutes correspondents are like really good at this, to like go up to someone and be like, hey, you're a liar, you know? That's like awkward. Now, if he's a jihadi leader and you're a young woman, it's particularly uncomfortable. So the other thing I was thinking, other than, okay, what's our strategy here? How much time do we have? Like, you know, the car is waiting, yada, 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 was how do I do this and look kind of, you know, not like I'm about to like barf because I'm so nervous, kind of.
What were you afraid of?
I was just, you know, sometimes fear isn't like a logical thing where it's like, I am afraid of that X will happen, or I am afraid. I think it's just, it was a really uncomfortable situation because when you, like I said, when you hoodwink someone, which in a sense it was kind of what we were doing, like we were just like, hey, we need to come back and ask you another couple of questions, and then suddenly you're like, hey, it's your men executing people in the backyard. Can you tell us about it? So and that's already like a really nerve-wracking and uncomfortable. And then, yeah, the fact that you're in rebel-held Syria and there's like bombs going off, and there were a lot of things to be thinking about. But I would stress that in all that, we had a very sensible plan in place. It's not like we were just going in there being like, let's just see what happens, bro. You know, like we really...
You put a lot of thought
Yeah, a
into the
lot of thought. And we
logistics.
were like, we can do this. This can be done.
Which is what you need to do to operate more safely,
Yes.
or at least feel like you have
Yeah.
a sense of control.
And I think like one of the real problems, especially in Syria, that I see at the moment is this kind of like huge group of freelancers who have kind of, and some of these freelancers are like, there's nothing there. This is not to be disparaging about freelancers. I think it is us as journalists who are kind of, or institutions are doing them a disservice as opposed to the other way around. But they are going into situations like Syria with no body armor, with no medical training, with no command of the Arabic language, maybe have like a few $100 on them, and it's like, you cannot go into Syria without major support. And I'm talking about financial support, institutional support. You know, I want to go in like for 60 minutes. I got to call them, you know, every 3 hours on this satellite phone. There's like and these are like major operations. An enormous amount of planning and preparation goes into them. And I see the way some of these young freelancers comport themselves in these war zones, and they're a danger to themselves and to those around them. And some of them are my friends and are currently in captivity in Syria. So, Yeah.
Who are they? Are they college kids? And why are they there? I mean, is it because they're not?
They're there because, like, they can be for the first time. Like, I think that, in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you were, like, a freelancer, I think it's actually pretty hard to, like, you kind of needed, like, institutional backing to get in with the military or get in, you certainly couldn't just get out of Baghdad airport and hail a cab. So Libya kind of gave everyone a taste of, like, hey, wait, suddenly anyone can go to these places, right? I don't need to have like the military's protection or the backing of an institution. And Libya was a little different, and then Syria came along, and there was this brief window where people suddenly thought it was okay to go in, and I had been going in since the beginning and knew full well that it wasn't okay. But it was sort of like, I was like Cassandra, like wailing truths in my tower, and everyone was like, don't listen to her, she's nuts, And now we see firsthand that, like, there's 15 journalists kidnapped in Syria at the moment that we know about. So it's serious business.
So you take a lot of precautions. It's a big operation, but there are things you can't control.
Yeah.
So what's the most dangerous situation you found yourself in, the most harrowing moment?
Well, I mean, in Syria, there's just like never been a trip where there hasn't been a really dangerous situation, which is why I'm kind of increasingly reluctant to go back in there, because I just think when you've never had a trip where you didn't, have a really close call, then, it's time to start thinking about going to other places. But I was in a triple suicide car bombing attack on the Palestine Hotel in Baghdad when I was 26. And that was probably the closest call I had, because we really all should have been dead, except that the last truck to come in got stuck on some concertina razor wire. And so finally, when he blew himself up, he was close enough to, like, pretty much destroy the hotel, but not to actually destroy the structure. Amazingly, no one in the hotel was killed.
Have you ever thought, that's it, I can't do this anymore?
I tell you what, I do have more, and I think this is normal. I'm like, people seem to think that people like me, or who do the kind of work I do, are like seriously brave and like really badass. And I'm like, I am a giant Pussy, okay? Like, literally. Like, I hear shelling and I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I mean, I really do not feel comfortable when there's like heavy artillery near me. When I hear a MiG, I feel like sick to my stomach. And I have noticed that the more time I have spent in conflict zones, the sort of lower my threshold is for that. Now it's like, before it was kind of like, wow, that was a big bomb. And now it's like, that was a big bomb. I want to go away from here immediately. I get scared, and that's important, because fear is there for a reason, people. It's telling you when you're doing something stupid, so listen to it. And there's, you take what risks you feel comfortable with, but listen to your gut.
So this fall, we have nearly 1,000 students enrolled in our news literacy course. And we've been talking about the power of information, how information is so powerful that people risk their lives to get it, and also the great lengths that people go to stop it. And so you've spoken a bit about the former. I wonder if you can speak to the latter. What are some of the hurdles that you faced in trying to get the story?
Oh, I mean, it's sort of endless. And I mean, in the case of Syria, unfortunately, I think the government's actually been pretty successful in trying to quash independent reporting there, because they have made it so very, 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 very dangerous and so difficult, while allowing journalists and smaller groups to report with visas from the government, with all of the limitations that entails. And it's not just about war zones, right? I mean, no matter where you are in the world, somebody wants to control the narrative of that story. And that includes here in the United States, although I think we're a lot better at sort of hiding the ways that we maybe try to control the narrative. But it's still there. And I mean, in China, for example, I was sort of joking about this with you earlier, but like, I would get off the plane in any airport in China to do a reporting story, and like the local communist official would already be waiting for me, like, ni hao, I'm going to be your guide for the next 2 days, you know, because people don't want you to go and discover the truth for yourself, because it sounds like a really simple thing, but it's incredibly threatening, especially to oppressive regimes, especially to regimes that thrive on the suppression of information. This is something that we take for granted, but like the countries like China, people cannot even tweet about what they want to tweet about. They have to come up with like really clever ways of doing it. You know, they'll take like the Chinese character for like the word for like 4th of June will also look like, you know, the Chinese character for table, 4th of June being the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, sorry. And so they'll like tweet about tables instead, you know, I mean, they bend over backwards to try to engage in kind of meaningful and spirited discussion about these really important issues that are affecting their countries. And that's a real threat to governments that don't allow any kind of free speech.
So when you're dealing with all these people who are trying to put their message forward, how do you know who to trust? I mean, especially in the situation in Syria, where there's so many competing groups. How do you know what the truth is? How do you know who to trust?
I think that's where experience comes in, because I have noticed, you know, I've noticed myself as a journalist and the progress that I've made and that hopefully I'm still making in terms of being able to discern what is, you know, valuable information, or, you know, whenever a story looks too good to be true, it usually is. And that's kind of a really tough lesson to learn as a journalist, because it's like, oh, but I so want this story to be this story. And I think we all tend to do it a bit. In the beginning of Syria, it was like, okay, so we've got oppressive regime and we've got freedom fighters, right? And it's like, it's actually kind of more nuanced than that and more complicated than that. And in television especially, it's like, we hate complicated things because we don't have like endless inches of newspaper to explain things. But yeah, I think learning to appreciate nuance and taking everything with a grain of salt is really important, because people are all the time trying to control you and trying to make their narrative the narrative that comes through in your work.
So you've been on the ground in Syria. Can you tell us then, what is the story that we're not getting, or what is the story that we're not understanding?
Oh, man. I mean, where do you start? Unfortunately, I mean, look, I think the story that we're really not getting at the moment, because we're so bogged down in the geopolitics of this, and should America strike and should America not strike, and what is Iran's role in this, and what is Russia's role, and Saudi Arabia, and this is a proxy war, and we've got the regime saying this, and we've got the rebels saying that, and we're not hearing a whole lot from the civilians. And, you know, this is such a cliche because it is true, but civilians are the people who get screwed in war, like every time. It doesn't matter. There's no such thing as a righteous war in that sense. Civilians bear the brunt. They are the people who have to go to sleep every night under the sound of like constant shelling and bombing and fighter jets. They are the people who cannot walk to the market 2 streets because there's snipers in all the buildings there. They are the people who are being forced to leave their homes in Syria in the millions. And they are the people, unfortunately, for the most part, who are actually really too afraid to speak their mind on camera, because they're afraid of both sides. And that's a story, because it's so dangerous to go to Syria now, and because it's really, even if you do go, it's so difficult to move around. You need, if you're going to go in with the rebels, you need the protection of a sort of rebel paramilitary force. So I can't just go and like talk to a woman and her kids and be like, lay it on me, sister, like tell me what your life is like, what are you feeling right now? It's really hard to do that. I'm lucky as a woman, I get a lot more access to that world than men do, but in general, both sides are kind of, you know, and I would say that people in these rebel-held areas are definitely more frightened of the regime than they are of the rebels, but there's no doubt that like there's intimidation coming their way from both sides, And they feel like it's much better for them just not to talk at all, not to rock the boat, don't cause any problems. And so I really feel like that's missing from this sort of lack of a humanity in our coverage now, because so much of it's about the politics.
We've also seen a lot of civilian casualties, and I wonder, working in television, how do you make decisions about, what's too gory? What kind of conversations do you have with your editor, with your camera people, about what to show and what not to show?
Well, I'm always fighting to show more, not because I'm, believe in like gratuitous displays of horrifying violence, but because I think you don't want to sanitize this either. Like, this is war, and war is ugly. There is nothing uglier in the world. And when people are blown up, it's horrifying. And, I'm not proposing that we show sort of mangled corpses, as a lot of actually the Arabic language channels do, because I think that can have a dangerous effect too. And I see people becoming so desensitized to violence that it's just like they don't even react or respond anymore in a way that's, perhaps productive or helpful in some way. But in the case of the U.S., I remember having a discussion. I did a story on a hospital in Afghanistan that only treats victims of war, and there was a young boy who picked up like unexploded ordnance next to it roadside, and he thought it was a toy, and his brothers were like, put it down. He was like, no, it's my toy, and put it in his pocket, and it exploded, and he was brought to this hospital, but he was already dead. And there was a shot. He had been, the bottom half of his body was basically gone, but the top half of his body was sort of untouched, and he really looked like a little angel kind of lying there. And, we had a long back and forth about whether we could show even his face, really, because it was horrifying, because it's a 5-year-old beautiful boy who, should be out playing and having a beautiful life. But I won in the end, and I think the piece was really, I think that image really stayed with people. Even though it's a hard image, it's an important image.
And what about these images staying with you? I mean, how does seeing all of this impact you? And
I think that I am pretty good at dealing with it because I talk about it a lot with mainly with people who cover the same sort of work. It's always different talking about it to people who don't cover it as well at all, because you kind of don't want to upset them, you don't want to burden them. But we have a really good network of people who do this kind of work, and I would also say, at the risk of sounding weird, that I cry a lot, which I think is a really, if I see something horrifying, I will keep it together in the field, because you have to keep it together in the field. But, afterwards I will have a real weep about it. And, when I was in that room with these women who were pulling their hair out, at the time I just kind of was like, okay, I got to power through this. But after I left, I thought about it a lot. I wrote about it a lot. I cried about it a lot, and I feel like I kind of, it's like grieving, right? I mean, you have to. I mean, personally, everyone has their different ways of dealing with these things. But for me, it's like grieving. And yeah, and I don't ever want to be the person who is so cynical or so hardened that I will just see dead bodies and I'm like, whatevs. Because, a dead body is a horrifying thing to see, and, you really don't want to see too many of them if you can avoid it.
do you see yourself doing this for a long time, or will you ever
I
want to
don't
come
know what
home?
else I would do. No, I do, because I love my job. This is a really great job, and if I haven't totally freaked you all out right now, if any of this stuff sounds appealing to you, then this is an amazing job. I mean, you're going and living in people's homes and seeing their lives in faraway countries that you have never even thought about previously, and that's just the most extraordinary thing. I think obviously at some point, if I have children, I will have to re-examine some of the things I do and some of the risks that I'm willing to take. But I'm pretty cautious in general, to be honest. And I do think that there are ways you can still go to Afghanistan in a responsible way. I mean, this is the other thing I would say. Everything looks scarier from outside, right? You know, you tell people that you go to Afghanistan, they're like, oh my God, that is so insane. And it's like, okay, what I'm not going to tell you is that, like, there's like some pretty decent boutique hotels, some nice restaurants, a couple places you can have a little drink. Like, it's much more manageable than it maybe looks from the outside, and less scary, while you always have to be alert and aware of the risks.
So one question that I got a lot working as a female foreign correspondent is, what is it like working as a female foreign correspondent? My answer is always like, well, I don't know what it's like to be a man.
Yeah.
But
easier to pee.
Right.
Is what I would say.
But what's your experience been? Especially working in the Middle East?
That sounds like a joke, but really, honestly, if
Yeah.
you spend like 6 hours in a Humvee going across the Iraqi desert and you're like, man, I wish I had a shiwi right now. So what's it like? In my experience, it is, I actually think, you know, someone once told me that in Afghanistan, they were like, you are an honorary male in our culture. And I was like, that's kind of awesome, because you do have this weird, ambiguous status as a woman operating particularly in these types of places where you're not held to the same standards that their women are, but you're obviously not treated like their men are either. You enjoy this kind of unusual freedom, but also are accorded tremendous respect. And as I was mentioning before, and I'm sure you found this as well, you have access to women, which is, hello, 50% of the population. And, you know, if you're a man and you're working in Afghanistan, you are never seeing a woman. I mean, maybe in Kabul and more cosmopolitan, but you go out into a village, you will not lay eyes on a woman. You will not, let alone have a conversation with them. So I find it to be, and by the way, women know everything, it turns out. Like, you go and sit down with like the wife of the local commander for a while, you have all the gossip on the village. Like, you have this thing down by the end of that chat. And you probably have learned how to make kibbeh in the process, because they love to teach you how to cook if you will spend 10 minutes trying to learn with them. So I think that it is a tremendous privilege to work in these places as a woman, and that I believe we have a kind of, you know, a unique view that we can offer as journalists. And I think it's a huge misconception. People are like, oh, war correspondents are all men. Nuh-uh. I mean, really, like, the majority of women covering Syria, the majority of people covering Syria at the moment are women. And we're here in honor of Marie. So, like, you know, girls dominate here.
So we talked a lot about, you know, being there, but what about the fact that you mentioned in your introduction, there are a lot of YouTube videos being uploaded, there are a lot of people with mobile phones, there's a lot of information that's being spread. So what do you think that the role of the journalist is in, you know, Marie had said that she felt like she was the last reporter in a YouTube world.
I think YouTube is amazing, of course, for many reasons. It gives, you know, massacres that took place 20 years ago can't take place anymore without the world at least knowing about them. So I think that, you know, social media is incredible, the difference it's made, the sharing of information, it's extraordinary. But as I sort of mentioned in my comments, like, this information is like completely overwhelming if we don't have people out there who've been to these places, who understand the cultures, who can really sift through the information and digest what's important about it, what may be easy to verify, what may be much more difficult to verify. I mean, this is one of the struggles we have with Syria video, is like, how do you know where it came from? How do you know who shot it? How do you know it is what it says it is? I mean, even in Egypt, during this sort of clash between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood was putting up some pictures for their, like, propaganda war, and they were using pictures from Syria that they were just like, hey, this looks like the army oppressing people, we'll just run with it. Could be us. And, you know, if you're not the kind of journalist who's like, hold on a second, that's not what their uniform looks like. Or hold on a second, that's like, I can see a sign for like the town of Sarakab in the background, which I happen to know is in northern Syria. So that, that's why you need to have people who have the experience to and, and why we need to get better as journalists. I'm not saying we're doing a perfect job of it, because, we're certainly not. But all that information is no good to anyone unless you have reliable places that you can go to where you know that like people are going to tell you this is what's important and this is what it means and this is why. And that's not to say you shouldn't have multiple sources for that kind of that kind of processing through of all this information. But if you don't have anyone helping you sift through it and highlighting what's important or interesting, it just becomes so overwhelming that you'll just be like, okay, I'm just going to go back to watching the Kardashians.
And you obviously have a lot of experience now in the region, but are there ever moments when you're there and, how do you know what's true? How do you know how can you verify the information that you're getting even when you're on the ground?
I think I, as a younger journalist, rely a lot on people who I work with who are extremely experienced. And, it's never a case of just like, oh, the correspondent is like the brain person, right? No, the cameraman often is the person who knows better than anyone. I see you smiling because you know exactly. These people have been operating these environments for decades, like 40 years, some of them, okay? And they can smell, a whiff of something bad from really far away. They have excellent instincts, and they have a lot of experience. So I think that it's not possible to get it right every time, but you have a great team and you listen to people. That's what this is about. And this is what people sort of forget. This job isn't about me just yammering on to you about Syria, okay? This job is about me listening to lots and lots and lots and lots of different people and having long conversations and trips where I'm looking at everything and then coming back to you and being like, okay, this is what I think is kind of what's going on here.
Well, my job's not about yammering either, so I'm going to open up the floor to the students. If you guys want to come up to the microphone, don't be shy. Don't make me start calling on you. That'll be even more embarrassing. And just try to keep your questions short and concise. And who's first? Over here? It's always the boys that get up first. Come on, girls. I want to see some women. All right, yes.
Hello, Miss Ward. I write for the...
Please call me Clarissa. I feel like an old lady.
Okay.
Professor Ward.
Professor Ward. I was watching the 60 Minutes video and your interview with Ahmed Al-Abaid.
Yeah.
And I was talking about how when you showed the video of the execution to him, I was talking to my professors and my friends, and arguably, not a lot of reporters would show, for example, Obama videos of force feeding in Guantanamo Bay. So I was wondering how much of the decision to show the video to Abaid relied on enforcing justice.
That's a really interesting question. And, if I get to interview President Obama at any point, I can think of a few videos I'd show him. So I'd like to think that it's kind of equal opportunities in terms of taking people to task or holding them accountable for their actions. I think it's a little bit dangerous as a journalist if you start to get into the business of like, I'm duking out justice or whatever. And I think we've seen that with some TV shows like Catch a Predator or whatever, where it's like, my job is not to mete out justice, is not to stick it to the man, or no. My job is to anticipate in an interview situation the questions that you would want to ask. And if you had seen this video and you knew that this guy was responsible for it, you as the viewer, I think you would want to ask, hey, dude, you said that your prisoners love you, but that's not love. So I think that, journalists should stick to trying to get to the truth and trying to tell stories and trying to anticipate what the viewer wants to know. But I do think it's dangerous for journalists to get involved with, like, you're the good guy, you're the bad guy, and I'm going to take you to task, and it's going to make me look like a real badass.
Well, I just want to follow up on that. I mean, are there any moments where, especially being in Syria, and you witness one side perhaps being more powerful or meting out more violence than another, and you start to form opinions about who's the victim and who's the...
Yeah, of course.
So how do you prevent yourself from letting those opinions affect you?
You know, they do affect you, and you do have opinions, and you can have candid conversations with people, but at the end of the day, I just think it's like the most sacred thing about journalism, where, like, it doesn't matter how firmly I believe something, it doesn't matter what conclusion I have reached through my job is not to tell you what to think. My job is to, like, tell you about what I've seen so that you can think about it and come up with your own take on it. And I really believe that firmly. And I think that there's a dangerous culture in the U.S. now, you know, among certain, you know, certainly cable news channels where it's like opinions, I'm going to make you think that, I'm going to make you think that, you know, let people think what they want to think. Just give them give them the information that they can make informed decisions for themselves.
Word. Okay. Over here.
Hi. Well, yeah, I'm tall. Sorry.
That's all right. Story of my life.
Okay. So, with regards to what you said about opinion, you were alluding before to your time at Yale, and I was thinking as you were speaking about that, so many universities across the United States, many of them very big names, posh. I mean, even places like Stony Brook here, there are so many students who are not really in tune with current events and everything like that, aside from what the opinions of their professors and what they're feeding them, because they otherwise don't have much of an interest. Do you feel that the universities are giving the opportunity, or just giving in general, a good or complete education?
Well, I mean, when I heard about Stony Brook's news literacy program, I did think to myself, oh my goodness, this should be like mandatory for no, it really should, because what this is about, you know, I had a wonderful education at Yale, and it really was, you know, I can't complain about it at all, but this is about some of the topics that you deal with news are really kind of complicated, and they can be intimidating to people. And this is about just giving people the basic language and vocabulary that, and you know, and some of the sort of basic concepts that kind of, you know, dictate the sort of news flow. And allowing people, therefore, instead of being intimidated by this stuff, to find it kind of interesting and to not feel like, oh, you know, I don't want to have an opinion on that because, like, what do I know about that? To be like, you know what, I do know a little bit about this, and I therefore feel comfortable reading about it and talking about it because, yeah, this is like kind of really important stuff. I mean, and that's the other thing. Like, as much as I love my French New Wave cinema class, and I really did, you know, it's, and I'm not saying academia isn't important and that literature, you know, those things are very important too, but I feel like all of us as citizens of the globe really need to be a little more engaged with some of the issues that are kind of making, you know, the world tick right now.
I just want to state for the record that we did not pay her to say that.
What? Damn it.
Hello, Professor Ward.
Please, Clarissa. Clarissa.
You said so.
I'm not even a professor. But.
All right.
Neither are we, but small details.
I wanted to know, when you're reporting in any of these worldly places across the globe, how do you deal with gag orders from those governments? Not just those governments, but even our own.
How do I deal with what, sir?
Gag orders.
Gandors?
Gag orders.
Am I missing?
Gag orders.
Oh, gag orders. I'm sorry. Well, you know, forgive me. Gag orders, you know, when, like, there, well, I don't report in the U.S., so I really have not done any reporting in the U.S., so I have no experience there. But the places that I report from, it's pretty much like everything is a gag order. Like, you're not really allowed to talk about any of this stuff. So I just don't really listen to the people who are issuing the gag orders, except when I have to have tea with them and be really charming and tell them how impressed I was by the mosque and the architecture and the nice souk. And then I just go about and do my business and, hope that they don't watch it in whatever place I am in.
Over here.
Hello, Clarissa. My name is Faith, and I really appreciate your speech tonight. It was so mind-blowing. Yeah, I'm a journalism minor, and I always dreamed becoming like journalist in the future. But still, I'm very vague about how to become one. So if you are to tell me or other students to do like what we must do,
Yeah.
just this one thing, what would that be?
It's the most annoying thing about journalism. Like, I remember like being in college and Googling like, how do I become Christian Amanpour? And it like didn't say anything. I was like, what? This is like a design flaw. No, there's no one way to do it, right? But I would say there are a number of paths you can take. You start trying to find internships if and when you can. And from there, maybe you're fortunate enough that they lead into something a little more permanent, or maybe you do what I did and like go to every single newsroom in America and beg people to like pay you very little money to work overnight. Or you can, if you're feeling bolder, you could do something like what I did a little bit later on, which is to go and move to a country, maybe where you speak the language, or maybe where you feel you can offer something on the ground that news organizations don't already have in place that would kind of, ideally lead them to come to employ you as a freelancer. So I think there's not one way to skin a cat, really. The only thing I would say is that working in news is hard. It's really hard to get jobs in news. A lot of people want to work in news. You have to really want this. This can't be something where you're like, well, it's kind of a toss-up. Like, do I want to be a banker or do I want to be a journalist? It's like, go and be a banker, because the whole journalism thing just is not going to work for you unless you have to want this and want it bad, because it's really hard work and 90% of the time it's not much pay, and it's, you do it because you love it.
Hi. Having gone through all of the experiences that you have involving danger and war, do you feel that you're almost hooked? Meaning, if you were to step away now, you won't be able to find something that'll fill that void, which is as interesting or as fulfilling.
I think this is the most dangerous thing about my profession, and I think a lot of journalists who do what I do struggle with that, because you do become addicted to, some people become addicted to the adrenaline, some people become addicted to the excitement. It's very hard for them to go back to like a normal life and just kind of sit there and like talk with their friends who are, leading very kind of normal lives. And that is something I am extremely mindful of. And I, do my best to combat that, because my closest friends are not, I have very close friends who are journalists, but I have all my childhood friends who are still my closest friends are not journalists. They don't work in war. I have a boyfriend of 6 years who told me the first time I met him that he thought old war correspondents are egomaniacs. And I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. How did you know that? And, but he, so it's like people keep you grounded, in other words. People who, because a lot of people are like, oh my God, you're like curing cancer. And it's like, no, I'm really not. And it's important to have people like that in your life who love you and who know you for who you are from way before you started doing all these exciting things, and who kind of keep you grounded.
Thanks.
So I hope I'm not out of line, Dean Schneider, by saying that if you ever want to take a break, you're welcome to come teach news literacy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, Clarissa. So my question is a little bit more on the political side. So through speaking to the Syrian people and seeing that so many multi-ethnic rebel groups are starting to come into Syria, Specifically, I remember hearing something about on NPR the other day about another group from Iraq coming in called the ISIS recently.
Yeah.
Do you see a positive future for Syria or the Syrian people specifically? Or do you see, because from what I'm seeing so far is the Syrian people being torn apart on both sides, the rebel side and Assad's government side?
You're exactly right, and it's heartbreaking. And I would say, just so we have like clarity here, that like in the, the rebels are no heroes right now, and there's a lot of nasty guys among them. But the scale of their atrocities, like, pale in comparison to the scale of atrocities that the regime has been perpetrating, largely because the regime has better weapons and planes and lots of other things. So when I look at the Syrian people and I think of what they deserve and the kind of future they should have as some of the more educated and warm and hospitable and articulate, lovely people in the Middle East, I think, wow, this country should be like a shining pillar for other Middle Eastern countries. This should be an example of diversity and, secularism. And when I look and think of what actually lies ahead for the Syrian people, it is absolutely heartbreaking for me to say that I see blood and more bloodshed and more killing, and until one side feels like they are really ready to sit down at the negotiation. Because I lived in Lebanon as well, and that civil war went on for 15 years. 15 years of people killing each other. And by the way, it's always like a small group of people who are really doing all the killing, and the vast majority of people are like, this is horrifying, this is awful, we just want it to end. But the people who keep it going can keep it going for a really long time. And in Lebanon, in 15 years, 150,000 people were killed, okay? Now, Lebanon's a small country of 4 million, but Syria, 2.5 years, 110,000 people, okay? And it's a country of 24 million. And I do worry, sometimes I think, I'm not in the business of taking sides, but what I do know is that Syria is not going to go away, and that if hundreds of thousands of people are going to die there, it's going to be a real stain on our record as Americans and as a global community.
So let me just follow up on that. If Assad does hand over the chemical weapons, what impact will it have?
The chemical weapons are a sideshow. 1,000 people have been killed by chemical weapons. 100,000 people, more than 100,000 people have been killed by conventional weapons. First of all, there's no way of accurately really knowing that, of course, there's a bonus, right? If you hand over most of them, that's, it's good news for Israel, because it means that hopefully these chemical weapons wouldn't get into the hands of like jihadists who might try to attack Israel with them. But in terms of like the suffering of the Syrian people, the chemical weapons is a distraction, I think, from the real issues going on here. And I don't see, suddenly Assad emerges as like, I'm the state actor who is like engaging in the diplomacy and, calling the shots in terms of how we try to resolve this whole thing. Well, I'm skeptical.
Do you have an opinion for how we should resolve this whole thing?
Oh, I have a lot of opinions, but I'm not going to bore you with them now. It's a complicated, there's no easy answer with Syria. There really isn't.
Hi. Earlier tonight, you mentioned how at any Chinese airport they had like a communist person confront you, or whatever. Have you ever gotten like any like footage or cameras confiscated? And if you did, can you walk us through that process?
All the time. It's like we like carry spare cameras for that stuff. We're like, yeah, you take that one, buddy. I got like 3 more in here.
Don't you lose like valuable information?
No, I mean, we do. We have lots of little tricks as well, where it's like, a lot of cameras nowadays record on a tape and a card. So you like show them the stand-up you did, and you're like, look, I deleted it. Do you feel like a big person now? And they're like, yes.
And they give you back the
Good,
camera?
because it's still on the card.
Oh, wow. And they give you back the camera and everything afterwards?
Not always.
Oh.
But, sometimes you'll have cameramen as well who are like, I am absolutely not handing over my camera. There is no way over my dead body will I hand over my camera. And you just sort of look at them and you're like, dude, I am not spending the night in jail. Give him the camera. But I have the most, give him the camera. Sometimes
All right.
you got to give it
Thank
over.
you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Clarissa.
Hi.
With all the different places that you've been and all the different cultures that you've had to adapt to over the years, is there like the one place that you get assigned and you're like, yes, I get to go here?
That's a really good question. I'm clearly not working in the right kinds of places because I can't think of anywhere offhand. I mean, look, I love Beirut. I lived in Beirut for several years, and I love going back there because, you know, everybody thinks of Lebanon, they think of like war, and like the reality is there's like an amazing nightlife and beautiful beaches, and you can go skiing in the morning and swimming in the afternoon, or so people tell me. I've never actually done it, but so I would say Beirut, and I have like so many friends there, and I love the Lebanese people, so, and the food's really good. So yeah, I get, when people are like, go to Beirut, I'm like, oh, really? Yes.
All right, well, sorry for the rest of you guys. I think we're out of time, but our student media are going to get a few minutes with Clarissa after this, so you'll have to read in the Statesman and the Stony Brook Press and the Independent the follow-up stories to tonight. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.